as it was mentioned, we're talking about religious influence on the founding of the United States or the founding fathers. I guess the same thing there. And I got to just confess up front, when Voss originally asked me to do this back in the winter sometime, I thought, well, what am I going to really talk about? We all know that there are a bunch of Freemasons and a bunch of deists, and so whatever. But I said, all right, let's look into it. I never really did. And glad I did, because I found out that those presumptions were really not true, and they're only such a small fraction of the story. So just a couple of disclaimers up front that all the stuff that I'm going to present tonight, none of this is my ideas. I hope that's obvious. And if there's anything that is my idea, you'll kind of know it is, because it'll probably be wacky, and I'll tell you it is. Something that I'm coming up with myself. And the other thing I want to ask for a disclaimer about is we're going to be talking about some people that have moral deficiency issues, like their stance or their practice of slavery, racism, military brutality. Not that those are invalid topics, but if we go off on those things, it will pretty much take up the entire night's presentation. So that'll be good for another time. Just some terms also up front. I'm going to be using the word orthodox with a little o. All right, to generally mean people or groups or churches that are adhering to the three main creeds: Athanasian, Nicene, Apostles' Creed. And Anglican and Church of England are going to be the same thing. When it gets here to America, they call it the Anglican Church, and it will eventually be called the Episcopalian Church, but not in the time frame we're talking about. The term evangelical, I was surprised to find that was a term that was used for Martin Luther's movement back in the Reformation, and it just generally meant people who were into the Bible and into justification by faith alone. So that was the term of evangelical. You may still see it on some evangelical Lutheran churches today. They'll be call themselves evangelical Lutheran churches, and that's where that's from. That's versus the Reformed churches, which came out of John Calvin. So those are the distinctions I'll use. And then those versus the sacramental and liturgical churches like the Catholic Church and what the Church of England is, the Anglican Church there. So here's a general outline of where we're going. Going to try to take you through these 7 big pieces of meta history that leads up to the Founding Fathers. And I think all these pieces are really important to get a feel for what they're all about. But rather than talking about any of them right now, let's talk about the big 6. I picked these guys as the big 6. I'm not the only one. There's other scholars who have picked them out. George Washington, our first president. The next 2 guys, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, second and third president. Ben Franklin, in my opinion, my favorite of the big 6, should have been a president, but wasn't. But those 3 guys, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, are, in my opinion, also the biggest influences on the ideologies on the just getting things going for the independence and the revolution. James Madison, called the father of the Constitution, main writer of our Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and him, and along with Alexander Hamilton, I put him up here, not just because he's got a big musical out, but because he was very, very instrumental in getting this whole thing ratified, writing the Federalist Papers, organizing that whole thing. So these are my big 6 that we're going to go after. I want to talk about Freemasonry, and I already heard that brought up tonight. So I was surprised to find that only 9 of the 56 signers of the Declaration were members of the Freemasons. Only 1/3 of the signers of the Constitution were members of the Freemasons. Interestingly enough, I found out that 29 signers of the Declaration were ordained clergy. That's an interesting statistic too. But about Freemasonry, I was looking to see, is there some kind of secret backdoor thing that they were trying to get going here when they were framing the country. And I couldn't find it. And what I did find is that there were some other scholars who did look into the Freemasons of that time to see if there was some kind of a backdoor plan that they were trying to get instituted in finding our country. And really, there's nothing to it. We'll talk a little bit more about what Freemasonry really was during the time of colonial America. It was more consequential than subsequential in the founding. Of our 6 big founders, these 2 guys were members of the Masons. The other 4 were not. John Adams did have some affiliation with Masonry, but I think, from my understanding, it's only in terms of giving them presentations or that kind of thing. The bigger question, were the founders deists? All right, so just really fast, these are our 6 guys. I just put check marks next to the 2 that I came up as being Freemason. All right. So now on to the idea that they're deists. So the idea of deism is that God creates the universe and sets it off and going with moral and natural laws, but he doesn't intervene in human affairs after that. He creates the universe and then he's off and running. That's our current day definition of deism. That was not what deism was back in the time of the founding. Deism was really a garbage pail, a catch-all phrase back then. If you weren't an atheist and you weren't an Orthodox Christian, they called you a deist. All right. So through the course of this conversation, I hope to show you that. Yeah, what I just did doing this. Okay, there we go. The idea that God is a clockmaker. All right, that he, like a clockmaker makes this incredible device and then sets it off and running and doesn't have anything to do with it again. That idea of deism, where God creates this universe and then goes off and does whatever else he does and doesn't bother with it anymore. That's not what our founders believed. That's at least what I find here. So deism is a child of Enlightenment ideology, and it's going to emphasize human inquiry, reason, and personal freedom over and against emotion, dogma, and mystery associated with religion. It was very influential in the colonies from 1725 through 1800. The horrible end of the French Revolution, though, with the later Enlightenment teachings and what brought in the French Revolution, just kind of put a pall on the whole enthusiasm about Enlightenment teaching after 1800 here in the colonies. The founders were of college age when deism begins to flourish in our colonies. So as you guys know, college is like the hotbed for new ideas and for influences and things like that. So that's exactly how deism, Enlightenment thinking and deism was going on back then. And it was associated with the Freemason movement. This author, David Holmes, makes the argument that it was sort of an alt church, a place where people could go and congregate over civic matters in a social and a civic way, but without the religious elements of the Orthodox Church. Next piece is, what would be a good test to see if our fathers were indeed deists or not? So we look at their church membership and their participation. A lot of people had to go to church. It was the law back then. But what was the level of their participation? Did they just go for the holy days kind of thing and then not otherwise? So we look at that. Number two, we look at the language and phrases they use in publications, letters, speeches. If they're using generic terms for deity, like nature's God, creator, great architect, things like that, those are deist terms. Those are Enlightenment terms, over and against terms like redeemer, savior, Lord, things like that. You wouldn't hear a deist use those things. And finally, what's the testimony of their acquaintances? What do families and friends say about them? And especially, what does their clergy say about them? So let's look at our big six. Alexander Hamilton, New York City guy. I picked on him because he is our Orthodox representative of the big six. He has some clouds over his head, though, in his life story. He was born out of wedlock in the West Indies, and that's not something easily shaken off in society. It's something that he carried around with him all the time. He also winds up getting in an extramarital affair right in the middle of all the founding hullabaloo. That was not a wise move. And we know he dies in a duel with Aaron Burr at the end. But he did attend Manhattan's Trinity Episcopal Church, which was in that day a bastion of Episcopal Church was an Anglican church then, and it was a bastion of Orthodoxy then. He attended King's College, which is now Columbia University, and that was a good school for good Orthodox people to go to. I found one interesting piece down in 1802 when Thomas Jefferson is running for president. Alexander Hamilton got all a buzz. He was like, we can't let an atheist be a president. So he tries to start this. He proposes starting this thing called Christian Constitutional Society. And get this, its point was to show the religious foundations of the United States. Just what we're doing here. That never gets off the ground, but that was what was in his mind. He wanted to show that we were a Christian country found on Christian principles. But here's the kicker for me. After the Constitution is all done and said and done, and it was noted that God was omitted from the Constitution, and he was asked, well, what's up with that, Alexander? And he says, we forgot. Seems pretty lame to me. All right, Trinity Church in Manhattan. If you ever get to go there, he's buried there along with John Jay, the very first Chief Justice of our Supreme Court. And John Jay and Alexander Hamilton were both Orthodox Christians in the founding of our country. You can go there. There's some historical pieces about it. Also, we used to know this as the last outpost of Christmas. Back in the days when you can go into Manhattan, we would go in there mid-January. They have an incredible Epiphany service, which I found really inspiring. And it gets a little apocalyptic, a little hair-raising at a point. If you ever get to do that, I think they have tickets now. You got to get ahead of time. So we're going to go from New York to Massachusetts. Our two guys from Massachusetts, John Adam. He was born and raised up in the Boston area, goes to Harvard, and Harvard is known at this time for coming to fore with Unitarian theology, which is considered a rational Christianity. That said, he was considered a church-going animal, not only by himself, others called him that. These Unitarians did believe in a personal God, providential guidance, resurrection of Christ, life after death, but they reject Orthodox beliefs of the Trinity and the divinity of Christ. So this is Enlightenment teaching creeping into what was then the Anglican Church, the Congregational Church up in New England. There's a quote down there which pretty much just shows what he really thinks about all that stuff. Ben Franklin, our other Massachusetts guy, he was one of 17 children, doesn't get to go to school, college, but he's a self-studier, stops going to church on Sundays at the age of 14 so he can study. At the age of 15, he claims himself a thorough deist. So he reads this treatise by Robert Boyle. And in that treatise, Robert Boyle is trying to argue against the deists. And Benjamin Franklin says, well, the deist had a stronger argument, so I'm a thorough deist. He's very active in Freemasonry. He's Grand Master of the Lodge in Philadelphia and London at one point, and also joins lodges in France when he does time there. But he is the one founding father that has a distinguished, is distinguished in that he signed all three establishing documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Treaty of Paris, and the Constitution. Here is a quote. Interesting. I wanted to do this one. In 1790, very end of his life, the president of Yale College, Ezra Stiles, asks him, what indeed is your creed, your faith? And he says, I believe in one God, creator of the universe, that he governs it by his providence, that he's to be worshiped, that the most acceptable service we render to him is doing good to his children, and that the soul of man is immortal. Okay, so you can read that. As for Jesus of Nazareth, I think the system of morals and religion that as he gave them to us is the best the world ever saw. So you can see he stops short of orthodoxy. And like most of these non-Orthodox founding fathers, respect Jesus highly, but they don't respect the Orthodox faith very highly at all. James Madison, we're going to go down to Virginia for our last three guys. This guy, to me, the most enigmatic. He is the fourth president of the United States, known as I said before, as the father of the Constitution. Now, before he goes to college, he's a very active member of the Anglican Church down in Virginia. But he doesn't do what a good Anglican would do, and that is go to William and Mary College in Virginia. Instead, and we don't know why, he comes up to the College of New Jersey, which is a fairly new school, and it's now called Princeton, and he studies under the Reverend John Witherspoon. And John Witherspoon is one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. He was a firebrand for independence. And in fact, he inspired a lot of the writings that Thomas Paine writings for Common Sense and stuff like that are attributed to the inspirations of things that John Witherspoon had done ahead of time. One of the things that's really interesting is he stays an extra year at school to study further in theology and Hebrew as well. And when he gets back to Virginia, he's appalled at what's going on religious-wise there. In Virginia, the state and the church, the Anglican Church, is part of the state. It's just like it was in England. And there was there was real contention if the Presbyterians try to get in, the Baptists try to get in. There was some actual violence against sects down there. And James Madison speaks up about that. And when he does, it suggests, well, maybe you're better suited for the cloth than you are for the law, for the bar. And after that, James Madison goes silent about his religious beliefs. All right, through the rest of his tenure serving in Virginia, through serving as president of the United States, we know very little about his religious beliefs. He does not give us a clue, or very little clue. But we do know that he attended church. He held family prayer, which is usually a sign of an Orthodox faith. But interesting enough, in the Anglican Church, you had to have a bishop to be confirmed. And until the late 1700s, you could not be confirmed in Virginia. So finally, they get bishops in the 1700s, and he chooses not to get confirmed there. George Washington, Virginian, also very active in the church. He actually was a church officer. He kept the fast days and would read services to the troops whenever the clergy was not available. But post-war, he did not take communion. He would go to church every Sunday with Martha and their niece, and he withheld communion whenever communion was given once a month. When his pastor confronted him about that, his solution was just not to show up on Communion Sunday any longer. We don't know why. I would like to offer, some people said, well, this is because he's a deist. I'd like to offer, though, perhaps like David, he was a man of war, and he just didn't, he felt he needed to refrain for some reason or other. But that's just me trying to give him a little out here. His acquaintance said he held a quiet orthodoxy, and his pastor called him a bona fide deist. Finally, Thomas Jefferson, also a Virginian, very popular because he was, we know him from the Jefferson Bible, right? He's the guy who cut out all the passages of the Bible that had to do with miracles, had to do with the deity of Christ, the resurrection, all that good stuff. This guy, I can't make any excuses for, all right? He was, though, one of the most learned and studied, book-read people. His library was so large, it actually becomes the Library of Congress. But he was all for restorationist Christianity, and it wasn't a fly-by-night thing. He had written a lot, thought a lot, and talked a lot about theology. However, when it comes out on it, once again, I got a quote there that shows he was very respectful of the doctrines of Jesus. However, he was not respectful at all. He said Paul, the Apostle Paul, was the first corrupter of Christianity, and it only went downhill from there. And he was hoping there for the day that the virgin birth would be classed with the fable of Minerva being birthed out of the brain of Jupiter. So this is our founding father in synopsis. And I just wanted to go over this idea about God not being in the Constitution. Here's one exception. In Article 1, Section 7, if any bill shall not be returned by the president within 10 days, Sundays accepted. Now, Christianity is the only faith system that observes Sunday. So this is like the only place where Christianity is inferred in the Constitution, besides being dated Anno Domini. That's all we get as far as God goes in the Constitution. That surprised me. I didn't realize that. So, in conclusion, many founders tended towards unorthodox, if not outright deistic, expressions of faith. The founding principles of the Republic were mainly inspired by Enlightenment philosophies and not Christian or religious ones. Ergo, there was scant religious influence in the nation's founding. That's kind of the common narrative. That's what started out, and I want to just say, not so fast. All right, we're going to go on a little bit of a journey here, and I put this bus thing up because sometimes if you ever took one of these city bus tours, they take you a flyby through a city and they show you the highlights, but you never get into much of it. Well, we're going to do that right now. With the time I have left, I'm going to race through those 7 pieces of meta history, but I'm going to waste time on this very interesting thing. And Joel, I don't know, have you ever heard of these guys, Hengist and Horsa? Has anybody ever heard of these guys? This is the only time I'm going to ask for any feedback.
They vaguely sound familiar. The emblem looks familiar, though. Where are they from, brother? I studied American history, and I feel bad I don't know this. All
right. Cool. It's good because I didn't know it either. This came up while I was studying for this thing. Hengist and Horsa. So what you're looking at here is a representation of the rear of the seal of the United States as first proposed by Thomas Jefferson. That's right. 2 days after signing the Declaration of Independence, a committee of 3 were formed: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Ben Franklin, my big 3, to come up with the seal of the United States. And this is what Thomas Jefferson comes up with. And we'll let John Adams, who's writing to his wife, tell us who these guys are. They're the Saxon chiefs from whom we claim the honor of being descended and whose political principles and form of government we have assumed. Guys, when I read that, I'm like, well, whoa. How come I never heard of this? And these guys are all excited about it. So I'll tell you a little bit about it. Anglo-Saxon Britain, we're going back to the 5th century AD here. So at this time, Rome leaves Britain, okay? Rome has fallen, so the soldiers are gone, and the Britons down south there are getting invaded by the Picts from up north. You've seen Braveheart, you know how they can get. So these Britons say, well, the Saxons have a really good reputation, and they hire these mercenaries from Saxony, headed by Hengist and Horsa. So 500 of them come over, and they help these Britons fight the Picts back up to the north, and they're successful. So the Britons give them some land in thanks over there, but the story doesn't end there, because apparently Britain's a nicer place to live than where these Anglo-Saxons and Utes come from, and the Frisians as well. And this mass migration starts happening over to that southeast of England. Thus is born Anglo-Saxon Britain. They pretty much take over that southeast section, and they form 7 kingdoms that are hot and heavy there until the Battle of Hastings, when the Normans come in 1066. What's such a big deal about their governing system? Well, it's called the Franc Pledge / tithing. Okay, and it was going to replace the existing blood feud culture. There was no government there to speak of at the time, and it's based around this idea of administrative groupings of 10 hinds or households. Now, if a village had 8 or 13 households, that would be the hind. It was created for self-policing and crime resolution, and all males 12 and older had to oath themselves to a tithing. So this is how the foundation of the society they're setting up. These hinds were meant to be, you did not want to bring dishonor on your hind, or the person who was over the person who was over the hind. You'd be excommunicated, all right? You'd be kicked out. So there was this sense of loyalty. This was a tribal thing that they built into that low level of society, but it doesn't end there. They group 10 tithings together to make something called a wapentake. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but this was the lowest level of government where you would find an army set up for armed conflict in case they needed to defend themselves. It was also called a hundred, a hund meaning 100, and a red meaning council. This was also the lowest level of court if there needed to be some things decided in the court. Doesn't end there though either. 10 wapentakes make up a shire. Anybody ever heard of a shire? All right. J.R.R. Tolkien was also a huge fan of Anglo-Saxon culture, and I understand. I just audited a course on him online that the entirety of the Lord of the Rings is based on Anglo-Saxon culture there as much as it could be. Over the Shire was someone named a Shire Reeve, and we have them today. They're called sheriffs. All right. So these were the counties that these Anglo-Saxons set up, and this was once again, this was another high level of law keeping in the land. Doesn't end there. There was then something called a witan or a witanagamat, and this is where different shire reeves and higher ups in society, eventually when the church gets in, the bishops will come involved. This is not a sitting council. This is an ad hoc council that would act as an advisor to a king. It would actually act, it would coronate a king, and it would actually act to depose a king if he wasn't carrying out his duties correctly. It will, they call it together for ceremonial reasons, civil reasons, whatever. It's not a sitting council. Now, you might see why that might be interesting to our founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson, 1774, writes this treatise of summary view rights of British America as a tract for guidance to the Virginia delegates to the First Continental Congress. And in this, he goes into this whole Anglo-Saxon setup to arm the delegates to go to that Congress and say, hey, we have a right to question the king, because what the king is now and this idea of the divine right of kings and all that stuff, that ain't the way it was, and that ain't the way it's supposed to be. That's pretty much what he's telling them through this old Anglo-Saxon system that he's appealing to. And guys, I don't know what prompted the question to do this presentation here, but it seems to me we're kind of on that same tack here. Like, maybe things are not going so right for us here in America right now. So we're like, let's go back to see what originally was intended to be. That's exactly what Thomas Jefferson is doing here. There's the front of Thomas Jefferson's proposed seal. These are just depictions. He really didn't draw this, but this is he did describe it. And that's a depiction of the children of Israel crossing out of the dry Red Sea into the promised land of by God. So right then and there, we've got some religion in the founding, okay? And not for nothing, This is Benjamin Franklin's proposed, the front of the Great Seal that he first proposes too. Moses standing on the shore, extending his hand, all right, causing the waters to part. And down there, he even keeps the pillar of fire in there to express that this is all going on by acts by the command of the deity, all right? So we got some religious foundings in there, guys. And even in our big deistic, quote unquote, deistic founding fathers, they're appealing to scripture for the founding of the country. All right, now we're going to race through these 7 pieces of meta history real fast. First, the New World. Please note, 1500 to 1600, it's a century long. The discovery or the occupation of the New World, if you need to. This is mostly done by Spain and Portugal at this time. France does get involved, as does Holland, but they're going over there and they're pretty much just exploiting it for the riches they can find. But here's a quote from a famous person who went over there. It was the Lord who put into my mind, and I could feel his hand upon me, the fact that it would be possible to sail from here to the east. All who heard of my project rejected it with laughter, ridiculing me. There's no question that the inspiration was from the Holy Spirit, because he comforted me with rays of marvelous illumination from the Holy Scriptures, a strong and clear testimony from the 44 books of the Old Testament, from the 4 Gospels, and from the 23 epistles of the blessed apostles, encouraging me continually to press forward, and without ceasing for a moment, they now encourage me to make haste. Who am I talking about? The one and only Christopher Columbus, the now infamous Christopher Columbus, born in 1451, Genoa, Italy. What you need to know about this guy is he wrote prolifically. He kept multiple journals on each of his 4 journeys, depending on his audience, is what he would write in them. That quote I just read to you is from a book he wrote called The Book of Prophecies, where he goes into the whole religious background of what sets him off and why he wanted to do this whole thing. Don't be skeptical about that, because that theme runs throughout all of Christopher Columbus's writings. Now, in Christopher Columbus's day, 2 years after he's born, Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Empire. So we've got Muslims going on over there, and that cuts off the trade into Asia. All right, you can see right under the small letter E of Europe is where Constantinople is approximately. And that red line would be called the Silk Road. And all that trade that was going on with Europe is coming really to a standstill at this time. Not only that, but off to the left of the screen, where Spain is, Spain during this decade, during this century, is fighting the Moors back into Africa. They eventually are successful. So this is the world that Christopher Columbus grows up in. Muslims to the left, Muslims to the right of Christian Catholic Europe. And he makes it his mission. One final quote that I'm going to give you before we move on from him is this idea that he wanted the sovereigns to undertake and prepare, as he went to prepare to go conquer the whole, to get riches from his things, that they would go and conquer the Holy Sepulchre. He urges the highnesses to spend all the profits from his enterprise to conquest Jerusalem, win it back from the Muslims, okay? This was what was on Christopher Columbus's mind. As far as I can tell, guys, in the studies, books that I read, I know it may not be popular here to talk about him in those respects, but even in the physical founding of the New World, there is religious foundation. I'm going to move right along to the Reformation. While all this discovery is going on in the New World, what's going on in Europe? Luther's stirring things up, and Calvin's stirring things up, and we have this time of the Reformation. Really quickly about Martin Luther, we know in 1517, he is not happy at all with the selling of indulgences. There was an actual uptick in activity for it because the Pope, we had an incomplete St. Peter's Basilica. The Pope wanted to raise money to get that basilica built, and so he pressured the clergy to sell these indulgences. And Martin Luther's just like, wait a minute, no, this is not Christianity as far as I can tell from the Bible. Does his 95 Theses things. Eventually he gets excommunicated. Please note, he did not intend to start a new sect of Christianity. He was hoping to be able to reform it from within. However, once he's excommunicated on threat of his life, that's when the Lutheran sect of Christianity actually begins. John Calvin, on the other hand, he's a Frenchman. And Martin Luther's ideas now, once again, in academia, they're the hotbeds. That's where all ideas are fomented. He goes to study in Paris, and he comes under the influence of these reformed ideologies. So eventually, Catholic France will have nothing to do with it. There's a lot of to do there. He has to flee for his life. And during one of those times, he is converted to a reformed Christianity. We know he writes the Institutes of Christian Religion, and he relocates and does Geneva. Now, I'm showing you these Swiss cantons for a couple of reasons. We'll refer to them again later. But interesting thing happens here. Switzerland is not part of the Holy Roman Empire. To the south of them is Italy. Over to the west is France. All around to the north is Germany, is the Holy Roman Empire. They are like this little island, and they're cantons. They're not really a country. They're this loosely affiliated provinces and regions. But they got their independence. They fought a war to be independent from the Holy Roman Empire. So this is a place to go. This is a place to retreat when the empire was on your back. And so naturally, this became a breeding ground for the Reformation. I put Zurich in there. That's where Zwingli started his Reformation piece, and the Anabaptists come out of that region, meaning again, and baptizing meaning getting dunked. They rejected the idea of infant baptism. They wanted to go with the idea that adults need to make a decision and do it on their own. And down there in Geneva, I marked where John Calvin did his piece. And now we'll see why. Tuck that in your pocket, because Geneva is going to come up one more time. Henry VIII we go to next, and now the English Reformation as we move closer to the founding of America. What's going on here? Henry VIII, originally he was in good with the Pope and actually writes a rebuttal against Martin Luther's captivity on the Babylonian captivity of the church. And the Pope gives him a designation of defender of the faith. But then 13 years later, he wants an annulment of marriage from Catherine of Aragon, his first of 6 wives. And the Pope says no. And he breaks from the Catholic Church. As you may know, he declares himself, or the Parliament declares him now the head of the church. So just to say, though, this isn't a whole Reformation thing at all. This is just Martin Luther wants to have a son, and he needs to get himself a wife that'll give him one, because Catherine didn't. And the Catholic Church now in England is, in all sense, Catholic Church, except for he kicks out all the monasteries, the Rome-attached monasteries, and sets himself up as quote-unquote Pope of the church there. And I did this chart up. This is one of my own makings. This becomes important because if you can see down here, we're going to get into the 1603 area under James I and Charles I. That's when colonization starts. And that's where I'm heading here. But you'll see we went back and forth a little bit on who was, what kind of royalty were ruling at that time. Edward VI and Lady Jane Grey, they were actually very much reform-minded times in England. So all of these academians and all of these clergymen who had an inkling of Reformed theology, they get a chance to try it out. They get a chance to start instituting some Reformed things here in England at this time. But then comes along Mary for 5 years, and she's not called Bloody Mary for nothing. She actually starts chopping heads off people who are not Catholic and who are trying to change the church away from Catholicism. And this may, if you have ever heard of John Knox was a clergyman at the time of Mary's going crazy there in England. And he actually has to flee and goes to the continent to save his life. John Knox then spends time with Calvin, right? He goes down to Geneva. And when he gets back to England under Elizabeth's reign, he forms the Presbyterian Church. So it's out of this whole milieu that the Presbyterian Church got started. The Anglican Church actually breaks up into parishes. Some of them reformed, some of them not. Now, this period, these 5 royalty from Elizabeth to Charles II, though I checked them off in the Protestant column, they're not really reform-minded kings and queens. Okay, they do make some overtures to it, but they don't make enough. And this is what causes the unrest, so that under James I in 1603, we see what's going to come next is the colonization of North America. We see such dissatisfaction and disrest of the religious there in England that they want to leave. We know the Pilgrims were first. I did this little chart up here of the different colonies that were founded. We know the Pilgrims came first, but really the first big colony was Virginia, a big colony that stuck. The Roanoke colony disappears, and actually that was kind of created just to be like a pirate outpost anyway, really not intended to be a colony per se. And then the other two I want to highlight, Massachusetts Bay and the Pennsylvania colonies. All right, I need to fly through this for time's sake. But just to show you, even though the Virginia colony was created to be mostly a commercial venture, it did have in its charter, at the beginning of its charter, this charge to propagate the Christian religion. Okay, so once again, we get that religious influence. Every charter that was given by England to found the colonies included a religious clause in it. And part of this, I put this quote here, we're not going to go through this, but part of this reasoning for doing this in the Virginia charter is that the Spanish were starting to creep up into the North American coast. They were already in Florida and they were coming up as far as the James River at this time, and England didn't like it. All right, so part of this is you need to propagate the faith to stop those Catholics. Okay, that was very big and very real, and we'll even see that coming up a little more. This guy, John Winthrop, founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, 1630, in my opinion, one of the most unsung heroes of our country's founding. This guy was not a clergyman, he was a lawyer, but he led this group of people to create this Massachusetts Bay Colony. Unlike the Virginia colony, this one was created to be a religious outpost first and commercial second. A model of Christian charity is the sermon he gives on the ride over. And his intention, the idea of it is that this colony they're setting up is going to be God's new Israel. This will be a city on a hill. They will be an example how if you model your society on biblical principles, that you will see how successful we are. And he was hoping then that England in turn would want to do the same. All right, that was their hope, that they would be that city on a hill. So naturally, he's elected first governor of Massachusetts Bay, and he's resistant to codifying any body of law. His idea and their idea was that the Bible was enough, that should issues come up that required legal attention, that learned men, Christian men would get together with the Bible and they would come up with a proper resolution. That was truly his feeling. Now, that didn't go over all the time. There were people who were insisting on laws, and as more people came over, they're like, hey, what is this? No, we need to know what's right and allowed, etc. So once a year, they'd have this election for governor. They'd vote him out, put the laws in, and then next time around, they'd vote him back in. So I think he was governor, voted back in 4 times for reasons like that, just because they wanted to get things done that he would not allow. Congregational church is the model of church polity that they made there. And the idea was we're starting the separation of church and state. They were allergic to that whole hierarchy of bishops and archbishops, which seemed to them more like state and civil servants than they did Christian servants for the Christian servants for the church. So this congregational model comes to play. It's their understanding that a church is responsible for raising its own pastor, for conducting its own business, and for deposing a pastor should need be. The state should not be involved in it. So they're pro-separation of church and state, but in order to be a voting freeman in the colony, you needed to be a church member. And in order to be a church member, you couldn't just say you agreed with the creeds. You had to be interviewed and prove that you were converted, right? This idea of conversion, that you made a decision in your life that you were going to live for the kingdom of God and for the betterment of your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. Okay, so that was really big in the founding of the colonies. They wanted to keep their faith pure, so no papists allowed. And in fact, Rhode Island is found on that premise because a preacher named Roger Williams started saying, well, hey, Catholics hold to the creeds too. They just got this extra thing called the Pope. But they would have none of it. So they kick him out, excommunicate him from Massachusetts Bay. and he goes and starts the Rhode Island, the Providence colony down in Rhode Island. Rhode Island then becomes kind of like the dumping ground. Whenever Massachusetts Bay doesn't like what you're doing religiously, you're sent to Rhode Island. So I think I'm going to take that up whenever I don't like something that Voss does religiously. I'm going to threaten to send him to Rhode Island or something here. So yeah, and they were allergic to Arminianism. If you had any sense that you were putting human will into your betterment with God, they would have nothing to do with that. So this is the Massachusetts Bay Colony, quite a thing. They were successful, and his son, actually, John Winthrop's son, John Jr., starts the Connecticut colony on the same premises and very successful. Real quickly, I want to talk about William Penn. Finds, this is about 50 years later, the colony of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So he's deeded that land, and he's a Quaker. And these guys, man, they rejected all religious formality, oaths. They were against violence and war, extravagance of dress, extravagance of speech. These guys were what we would call like that, the Jesus movement, the tie-dyed shirt, blue jeans, sandals, Jesus movement. They were that, strip everything away and just love one another. So he builds this colony on this Quaker premise. And in doing that, he invites any other persecuted Christians who want to come. And so we have this influx of all this, the wars, the religious wars going on in Europe. You have this influx of Lutheran and Reformed churches. The Mennonites come over, the Amish, the Brethren, the Schwenkvelders, who I never heard of. I don't know if they're around still. And the Moravians, they all come over. And that's how Philadelphia is formed, all right? So for a very summary here, our founding charter, the founding charter of every colony was did have a establishment in religion. Some of them on religious toleration, like Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, and some of them with a specific church. Virginia, that was the Anglican Church, and we just talked about the other two big areas. Religious observance was enforced by law in most colonies. You were fined if you did not go to church, and you were fined if you broke the Sabbath. If you celebrated Christmas up in Massachusetts Bay, you were fined. All right, that was not considered a thing you could do. The church was often supported by the state and raising of taxes, but attendance was about 60%, they say, in the late 1600s in the colonies there. We're going to move along now. The Enlightenment. Got to do this part really quick, guys. The Enlightenment was a really big intellectual movement going on, and this was very our founding fathers were exposed to this and very endeared to Enlightenment thinking. Not only them, but we'll talk about in a bit, so was the clergy in the colonies. So here are the 5 big guys that I found who really influenced the people in our time and in the founding colonies most. Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton are the 2 natural scientists here. Really interesting to note that Isaac Newton, they say, wrote 10 times more on theology than he ever did on natural science. So he was very interested in things of God. He was actually headed to be ordained clergy, but he got tripped up on the essence of the Trinity. He just couldn't reconcile the idea that the Father, Son, and the Spirit were the same essence. He really didn't have a problem with the idea of the Trinity, but that they were one. That's what really bugged him. So he disqualifies himself from going into the clergy, but he doesn't abandon his faith. That's just a thorn in his side, per se. Now, Rene Descartes, a couple of weeks ago, Frank Turek gave a presentation here on proofs for God's existence. And Rene Descartes is the guy who comes up with this, or he reformalizes the causal adequacy principle, the idea that every cause has an effect as a proof towards there being a God. And also he formalizes the ontological argument for God's existence. So Rene Descartes, another guy who's got that theological foundation to his Enlightenment ideology there. Montesquieu, this is the guy who comes up with 3 co-equal branches of government, all right? Checks and balances. This guy also says, but my system doesn't work if you don't have a virtuous people. And as far as I can tell, Christianity is the most virtuous system out there. So he recommends that this happens in a Christian society. Not that he's much of a Christian himself, that I found, but he's saying, like our founding fathers will say, this thing only is really going to work if you got virtue, and Christianity is it. Finally, John Locke. All right, I'm going to go through this. Part of this I can't see because of the, let's see if I can get this off my screen so I can read it. All right, so this is by David L. Wardle, and this is a summary of John Locke. And I thought that's important because this is pretty much where our Declaration of Independence came from, this guy. Locke believed that a government of men should model the government of their heavenly Father. Just as God's purpose is to promote the good of mankind, so also the end of government is the good of mankind. Just as God refuses to take from man that portion of his will, which he will not freely offer, so government has power over men only to the extent that they give their consent to be governed. Just as God gave men reason so that they could submit to his will, so must a man have reason before he consent to be governed. And just as a man may enter into a covenant of grace with God in order to receive life and immortality in the next world, men of reason may enter into a covenant with each other and agree to limit their agency, that is, submit their individuals to a collective will of society in order to preserve their lives in this world. This is the foundation of John Locke's. He's just, what he's saying here is that his ideas on government are just a reflection of what he sees God's ideas towards man. All right. I found that quite enlightening, but we're going to have to leave it there. But I just wanted to give you an idea that though our founding fathers were so given to Enlightenment ideology, it is not godless. All right. Now I want to talk about what I found to be the most fascinating piece of this study, and that's the Great Awakening. I had heard of it, but I really didn't know where it fit in history. I didn't know it came into play here just before the independence of America. I didn't know who the main characters were, and we're going to talk about them in a second. But just to give you an idea of what religion was like before the Great Awakening hit in the colonies. The colonies at this point were prosperous, okay? Success all over the place. Commerce has gone off the charts. And as you know, proverbially speaking, when times get good, faith gets weak. And that's what's happening. The churches are growing cold. They're actually losing membership in the churches where, you know, it was at 60% at one point. It's really starting to go downhill. And the pulpits now are being filled with Enlightenment trained clergy. Got to realize clergy in this day, this was more of a civil appointment, like being a mayor or something like that, than really it was a call to a pulpit. You would go to seminary, Harvard, Yale, or William and Mary, so that you could then be an overseer. And that's kind of where this went, is these guys now filled the pulpits and they used them as a place to expound on Enlightenment teaching. So it really became like a cold, formal Christianity in most of the colonies here. And next slide, we're going to talk about how it all gets started. Right by you guys in the Raritan Valley, okay? This is right smack where Rutgers University is. There was a group of Dutch Reformed people who had settled there. And they didn't have any Dutch Reformed pastors, so they appealed back to the continent and said, send us somebody. So they send them this guy, Theodorus Frelinghuysen. Now, sorry, guys, I don't have a picture of these two because I tried to keep the Creative Commons, and I guess they're not popular enough, so I don't have no picture of Theodorus for you. But so he comes over here, and he is frankly appalled at what he finds to be the religious climate here in the colonies. He came expecting, oh, the new world and everything they heard about it. And, you know, it's built on God and all this great stuff. That's not what he finds. And so he preaches his first sermon, his inaugural sermon on 2 Corinthians 5:20. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. Well, the people were appalled. How dare you think that we are not reconciled to God? How dare you come and preach this? They try to get him sent back home. The continent says, nope, you got him, you keep him. And so then Theodorus turns around and he kicks 4 of the troublemakers out of the church. He was actually circuit preaching over 4 churches there in the Raritan Valley. And the continent says, nope, you can't do that, Theodorus. You got to let them back in. So they had a rocky couple roads, a couple years there. But in the meantime, this guy, George Tennant, also local to the area, picks up on what Theodorus is doing, on trying to bring life back into the church, bring the Bible back into the church, bring God and the kingdom of God and all those things that the colonies lost. And George Tennant actually starts sharing pulpits with this Dutch Reformed pastor. Guys, that's not done. This was a first in the colony, that someone from a Presbyterian and a Dutch Reformed, they would start sharing pulpits with each other. Unheard of. But this is what the Great Awakening is going to bring into the colonies and these United States eventually, this breakdown of religious walls. Great thing. I put up here this sermon that Tennant creates called The Danger of an Unconverted Ministry. They actually go after all these ordained ministers because they're truly not, they're just Enlightenment, lecturers at this point, and they go after them. Well, you can imagine the hullabaloo that starts. This is now the height of the Great Awakening. Enter George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. I call these guys the Tale of Two Cities. I mean, I had heard of them. I didn't know they fit here in history, but I call these guys a Tale of Two Cities because they're so dissimilar in how they conducted themselves, but they're brothers in the Great Awakening charge here, in the Great Awakening mission, and they have the same effect. Let's talk about George Whitefield first. He's British. He's Anglican. He's an itinerant. He wanted to be an actor, and what he does is he brings the skills of an actor to the presentation of the gospel. He becomes so popular that they can't, and over in England, you can't fit in buildings anymore. So he starts these open air preaching ceremonies, and he's criticized how base and crude is that to be teaching out in the open air, but how effective he was. He sets his eyes on the colonies, comes over here, and he is known for just being one of these incredibly demonstrative evangelists. He drew crowds of thousands, 4,000s, 5,000s, 10,000s, 15,000. They report 20,000 at a outdoor meeting in Philadelphia itself. And he was a friend of Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin actually does a measurement at one point of how many people that he indeed is getting together there. So he's so effective bringing people out into these open air revivals. It was the thing of the day. Now, guys, one of the things I didn't mention though, these sermons that they write. I said to Voss a couple of weeks ago, I said, Voss, can you name for me a famous sermon? And he's like, I don't know, I guess Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God. No, like, yeah, that's like, if I asked you to name a sermon, that's the only one I could come up with. And that's Mr. Jonathan Edwards. He wrote the famous sermon. Jonathan Edwards is America's theologian. He is a brilliant man. He is a lover of Enlightenment theology. He's enthralled with Sir Isaac Newton's, the whole idea that we can find God in nature. He loves these whole ideas. He now, unlike George Whitefield, is born here in New England. He's Presbyterian, and he's a pulpit preacher. He doesn't have that booming voice that he can get to 20,000 people out in the open. He preaches from the pulpit, and he's a staid sermonizer. There's no theatrics here. He wrote his sermons out, read them in a monotone voice, but he had the same effect. All right. Very, very, very effective. And close this section talking about the results of the Great Awakening. We've got these new colleges. Hey, you guys, you're in there. Number 4, Queens College, Rutgers University was found because of this Great Awakening. I don't know if you knew that or not, but Brown University, Columbia University, Princeton, and even Dartmouth. The Congregationalists, as we mentioned, had been turning Unitarian. Well, we have new side Congregationalists now who want to be Orthodox Christian. They start Dartmouth University. So here we've got conversions, renewals, and a proliferation of congregations galore. They say that in 20 years, from 1740 to 1760, that 500 churches were added up in New England alone. They estimate that 25 to 50,000 people were converted to Christ in New England alone during that 20-year period. In the middle states, it was even, I couldn't find statistics on it, but the articles do say that it was even more effective in the middle states, the proliferation of congregations and converts. They couldn't keep up with filling the pulpits of these places. There was a lot of lay preaching going on at the time. This turned ecclesiastical world on its head. No longer could you get away with being a tenured clergy. You were now challenged. Congregational autonomy comes to fore. People were taking responsibility now for their own freedom in the faith. All right. Prior to this, what your clergyman said went. If he said you were good, you were good. But now this idea that you're responsible before Christ for your own faith, for your own spiritual walk. That became the new norm in Christianity here in the colonies. So it brings up this condoning a question of authority and never to settle for negligent overseers. You can see how this is going to be important when it comes time for the revolution, what this Great Awakening brings into American society. It instilled a religious toleration. Suddenly, these sects all realize, hey, we all have very, very similar doctrines. It's mostly church polity that separates us. So now they're starting to get together. And this starts American nationalism. This is the first intercolony event. Everything was being shared. Didn't matter if you're from Massachusetts, if you were from Pennsylvania, if you're from New Jersey. This whole movement was being shared across the spectrum. And finally, there was a rise, a turn of attention to explicitly bring Native Americans and slaves to Christian faith, and the repudiation of slavery finds a footing in the Great Awakening as well. We're going to leave that. I'm going to close up here. Founding Fathers. So these are the guys that I'm going to pick out as our big Orthodox guys. We talked about Alexander John Jay, Samuel Adams, you've heard of, Patrick Henry. Elias Boudinot, he was actually a president of one of the Continental Congresses, so he's here. And John Hancock, I'm putting him in because I couldn't find evidence to the contrary. I know he was a Mason, but we also find that he was active in his church. So we're going to give him, I'm going to give him a pass anyway. So I want to just close with a couple of quotes here. This is my second to last slide, and then I'll stop talking. This is by Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, at the end of their careers. This is Thomas Jefferson's second inaugural address, where he says, "I will need too the favor of that being in whose hands we are, who led our forefathers as Israel of old from their native land, and who has covered our infancy with his providence." And Ben Franklin, this one was a killer for me, guys. At the Constitutional Convention, all right, I'm really surprised that it has not been proposed by some other member at an earlier period of our deliberations of nominating and appointing a chaplain to this convention, whose duty it shall be to uniformly assemble with us and introduce the business of each day by and address to the creator of the universe and the governor of all nations, beseeching him to preside in our council, enlighten our minds with a portion of heavenly wisdom, influence our hearts with a love of truth and justice, and crown our labors with complete abundant success. And I propose to you, this is not deistic language at all. These guys have a firm feeling that and knowledge that God is on them. Last slide, an appeal to heaven. If you haven't seen this before, this was the flag that George Washington flew over the naval vessels during the Revolutionary War. Deists don't make appeals to heaven, okay? So the best I can give you guys is that our founding fathers were not deists, but they were theists, thorough theists. And here's just a last slide, the recommended reading. I wanted to put that up there for in case this, gets saved and you want some further reference. And that's it. That's my presentation.